Inside a blazing aircraft plant, a rescue plane worth tens of millions sat frozen by a propeller fault nobody could explain. 30 elite engineers had failed. The chief executive, Amelia Grace, was one signature away from losing a federal contract that kept the company alive. Nobody noticed Mason Carter, the quiet maintenance man mopping the floor, until he asked for 3 minutes alone with the shaft. When he pulled his daughter's old fidget spinner from his pocket to test it, the entire engineering floor erupted in laughter. 3 minutes later, that laughter died completely, and nobody in the room spoke. If you believe someone overlooked and dismissed can still save the whole sky, stay with this story until the end. The story began inside Grace Aero Rescue, a company known for building low-altitude rescue aircraft used during floods, storms, and disaster response across remote regions. On the night everything changed, the entire plant blazed with light because the newest aircraft, a project called the A-17, had failed its final propeller test. The plane was supposed to be delivered the following morning to a federal rescue unit waiting on the tarmac. If the delivery failed, the company would lose the contract, lose the trust of the market, and hundreds of workers would face the threat of losing their jobs. The trouble sat inside the propeller assembly itself. Whenever the engine climbed past a certain rotation speed, the blades shivered by a margin almost too small to hear, yet the safety sensors locked the engine instantly, refusing to let the test continue. 30 of the company's most decorated engineers stood in a circle around the aircraft, laptops glowing with vibration charts, aerodynamic simulations, and sensor log. They swapped sensors, inspected the shaft, checked the bearings, and rewrote portions of the blade angle control software, yet none of them could isolate the cause. Connor Ryan, the lead engineer, insisted the fault lived inside the sensor algorithm rather than anywhere mechanical. He wanted to disable the secondary warning layer so the delivery could still happen on schedule. Evelyn Madison, the flight safety specialist, pushed back hard. She reminded the room that a single flaw in the propeller could destabilize the aircraft in the middle of an actual rescue mission, far from any runway. Amelia Grace arrived in a dark blazer, her expression composed on the surface, though her eyes carried the weight of a company balanced on the edge of collapse. At the far side of the hangar, Mason Carter quietly wiped oil from the floor in his faded maintenance uniform. Nobody paid him any attention, even though he was the only person in the building not staring at a screen. His eyes stayed fixed on the actual propeller. Mason caught a rhythm in the sound, a nearly silent metallic hitch, like something pressed slightly out of true inside the rotating hub. He said nothing at first, because he understood exactly where he stood in this building. A man who mopped floors did not correct engineers with advanced degrees, no matter how confident he felt in what his ears were telling him. He watched the argument sharpen between Connor and Evelyn, watched Amelia's jaw tighten with every past minute, and still he stayed silent at the edge of the room. His hand drifted to his shirt pocket, where a small object rested against his chest, worn smooth at the edges. It was his daughter's old fidget spinner, chipped along one blade, carried every single day as a quiet reminder that he could not afford to break, no matter how heavy the world became. The clock on the wall read past midnight, and somewhere beneath the noise of 30 raised voices, one quiet man had already heard the truth the whole room was missing. To understand why Mason Carter stayed silent, the story had to step back into the quiet shape of his daily life. He was a single father who lived without noise, working the night shift so that his days could belong entirely to raising his daughter, whose presence in this story would remain mostly outside the frame, felt rather than seen. She existed through small details only: the little lunch container he packed before every shift, a medical bill folded inside his wallet, and the chipped fidget spinner riding in his shirt pocket like a small anchor. Mason had once carried real weight in aviation mechanics. He was not an untrained man, nor someone who had wandered into the trade by accident. Years earlier, he had designed balance systems for rotor shafts on light aircraft, respected quietly by the handful of engineers who actually understood his work. He left that world after a family accident and a divorce that broke something in him he never fully explained to anyone. He chose maintenance work on purpose, because it asked little attention of him and left him with the stability he needed to keep his daughter fed, clothed, and cared for. Titles meant nothing to him anymore. What mattered was whether the rent was paid and whether there was enough left over for her prescriptions. Inside the company, most people only knew him as the man who fixed stuck doors, replaced burnt bulbs, and wiped oil from the floor without complaint. Connor Ryan often spoke to him with open condescension, treating him as an obstacle who wandered too close to the real engineering work. Jackson Owen, the operations director, had once proposed cutting the maintenance staff entirely to save costs, leaving Mason's position perpetually uncertain. Amelia Grace had noticed him working late on more than one occasion, yet they had never truly spoken. To her, he was simply a diligent employee, nothing more. On the night of the crisis, Mason listened as the engineers argued around him, and he recognized the shape of their mistake immediately. They were reading electronic charts without listening to the machine itself. He heard the propeller stutter in a cycle too small for any screen to register, a signature that did not resemble a software glitch at all. It felt instead like a hidden point of friction sitting off-center inside the blade angle assembly, something physical, something a sensor could easily misread. Mason intended to stay quiet, as he always did, until he heard Connor propose disabling the safety warning to meet the deadline. That single suggestion changed everything for him, because it meant real danger for whichever rescue pilot eventually flew that aircraft into a storm. He looked down at the fidget spinner resting in his palm. To him it was never a toy. Inside it sat a tiny frictionless bearing, the very thing he had once used to teach his daughter why a spinning object could reveal an imbalance invisible to the naked eye. Mason stepped out of the shadow at the edge of the hangar and said, quietly but clearly, that the fault was not inside the algorithm at all. Every head in the room turned toward him at once, looking at a man who appeared to have forgotten exactly where he stood. Mason told Amelia that he needed to inspect the propeller shaft assembly by hand, without relying on the software at all. Connor Ryan laughed before she could even respond. He asked, with open scorn, what gave a man who mopped floors the authority to contradict 30 engineers with advanced degrees behind their names? Mason did not argue. He simply explained that the vibration readings were being misread because the sensor sat too far from the actual point where the friction was forming. Evelyn Madison caught the detail immediately and leaned forward, asking Mason exactly how he intended to check it. She had spent years watching engineers trust their instruments completely, sometimes past the point of common sense, and something about the calm certainty in Mason's voice made her want to hear the rest of his answer before dismissing it. Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out the old fidget spinner. It was small, scratched, faded from years of handling, one blade slightly chipped at the edge. The room went silent for a single second before the laughter broke out. Connor laughed the loudest of anyone present. He said the company was about to lose a contract worth tens of millions of dollars, and the man standing before them wanted to save it with a child's toy. Jackson Owen grew furious, certain that Mason was simply wasting precious time, and ordered security to remove him from the testing floor at once. Amelia hesitated. She stood between two impossible choices, one side filled with celebrated engineers who had not yet solved anything, the other side holding an ordinary maintenance worker with an object nobody in the room could take seriously. Every second she waited, the clock on the delivery deadline moved closer, and every option in front of her seemed to carry its own version of ruin. Mason explained himself calmly. He was not proposing to replace any aircraft component with the spinner. He intended to use its free spinning bearing as a temporary reference point, a way to reveal a pulling force the electronic sensors were currently smoothing over and hiding from view. He told Amelia that if he was wrong, they would lose only 3 minutes. If Connor was wrong, they could lose a pilot. That single sentence stopped Amelia cold. It struck at the fear she carried beneath everything else. Not the fear of losing money, but the fear of sending an unsafe aircraft into someone else's hands. Amelia granted him exactly 3 minutes, though Connor forced her to sign a statement first, declaring that Mason alone would bear responsibility if he damaged the propeller assembly during his inspection. Mason accepted without hesitation, not out of pride but because he could not let a dangerous aircraft leave this hangar under his watch. He carefully removed a small inspection panel, positioned the spinner against the edge of the secondary shaft, and used it as a simple improvised tool for sensing vibration by hand. Laughter still lingered around him, the internal monitoring cameras still recorded every second, but Evelyn began to notice something the others missed. Mason's hands did not shake at all. He moved with the steady confidence of someone who had performed this exact motion thousands of times before, long before this room, long before this company. The spinner turned freely for a moment, gliding without resistance, and then it suddenly caught, hesitating right at one particular angle of the blade. Mason looked up at Amelia, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. He told her it was stuck right there, at that exact point, and for the first time that night, nobody in the room was laughing anymore. Mason asked for the overhead lights to be dimmed and the secondary warning tones muted so he could listen to the real mechanical sound underneath the noise. Connor objected immediately, insisting that Mason's method fell far outside any recognized laboratory procedure. Amelia allowed it anyway, since Mason had not yet replaced a single component and was only performing a passive inspection. Mason turned the propeller shaft gently by hand, holding the spinner steady as a secondary balance point, then watched the faint reflection along the spinning edge to catch any microscopic hesitation in the rotation. Evelyn realized his method resembled the classical mechanical techniques used long before digital sensors existed, a discipline built entirely on looking, listening, feeling, and comparing rhythm against rhythm with patient attention. Mason found a tiny hitch, almost invisible, occurring exactly when the blade shifted from the third angle position into the fourth. It was too small for the naked eye to catch under normal conditions, yet large enough to trip the safety sensor once rotation speed increased past a certain threshold. Connor tried to dismiss it, claiming it was nothing more than surface scratching, the kind of blemish that appeared on any well-used component. Mason pointed out that the mark did not sit on the outer surface at all. It lived inside the locking washer of the pitch adjustment assembly, a washer that had been installed backward, creating pressure only once the shaft warmed under sustained operation. The engineering team grew quiet as the implications settled over them. This was exactly the kind of flaw a computer simulation would miss entirely, since the technical drawings assumed by default that every washer had been installed the correct way around. Mason asked for the locking washer to be removed for inspection. Connor resisted, aware that if Mason turned out to be right, the failure would fall squarely on his own engineering team. Amelia instructed Connor to proceed anyway. The mood in the room shifted from mockery into something tighter, more uncertain, closer to dread. Even the younger engineers who had laughed loudest minutes earlier now leaned in, watching Mason's hands with a kind of attention they had never given a maintenance worker before. Once the locking washer came free, Evelyn spotted a thin streak of metal worn unevenly along its inner edge. That streak was the exact source of the vibration that had haunted them all night. Mason did not gloat over the discovery. He simply stated that this washer could never be reused, that it needed replacement with a component built to proper specification, and that the entire assembly required testing at both low temperature and full operating temperature before anyone trusted it again. It mattered greatly that Mason never turned the fidget spinner into an actual aircraft component. He used it strictly as a temporary diagnostic reference to demonstrate exactly where the fault was hiding, a detail that kept the entire scene grounded in believable mechanical logic rather than spectacle. Connor made one last attempt to save face, suggesting that this discovery amounted to nothing more than lucky guessing. Mason answered quietly that luck did not produce a wear pattern shaped by a repeating cycle. The short reply left Connor without a response. Amelia looked at Mason differently now. This man, dismissed as invisible only minutes earlier, had just saved her from the most dangerous decision of her entire career, a decision that could have sent an unstable aircraft into the hands of people trusting it with their lives. She said nothing yet, but something in her had already begun to shift, a quiet recalculation of who deserved to be heard inside these walls. The damaged washer sat on the inspection table afterward, impossibly small for something that had nearly brought down an entire company. A single overlooked part, barely the size of a coin, had come within minutes of collapsing everything Grace Aero Rescue had built. Once the fault had been found, the plant shifted into a new kind of emergency, one focused on correcting the flaw properly within an impossibly short window of time. Connor tried to reclaim control over the repair process, but Evelyn suggested that Mason remain nearby to oversee the inspection, since he understood the root cause better than anyone else present. Jackson Owen refused the idea outright. He worried that letting a maintenance worker stand beside a flagship project would make the company look unprofessional in front of its clients. Amelia found herself pulled between two competing pressures: the polished image the company needed to project and the plain mechanical truth sitting on the inspection table in front of her. Mason asked for no title, no payment increase, and no place in front of the client. He only wanted certainty that the aircraft would not fail once it left this hangar. While the team waited for a replacement part to arrive, Evelyn quietly pulled Mason's personnel file and noticed it had been unusually trimmed down. Before joining Grace Aero Rescue, Mason had worked for a research group focused on low-altitude rotor systems. Evelyn dug further and found his name referenced inside an old technical report on rotor balancing for rescue aircraft, a report that had once been cited inside the very training materials used by this company. Amelia learned of the discovery but chose not to confront Mason immediately. Instead, she watched him from a distance as he wiped grease from his hands and placed the fidget spinner back into his pocket with a kind of careful attention usually reserved for something precious. A brief memory surfaced within the story, revealing that Mason had once stood at the edge of a much larger career before a family tragedy and a painful separation reshaped everything he wanted from life. He chose quieter work afterward, deliberately, so he could remain present for his daughter. She remained absent from direct scenes throughout the story, mentioned only through the voice of the narration, yet her presence shaped every decision Mason made that night. The fidget spinner had been a gift from her, handed to him during a period when he had lost faith in almost everything. She had told him once that anything spinning off balance simply needed someone patient enough to look closely. That small sentence had stayed with him through every difficult year since. Amelia began to see Mason differently, not as some flashy hidden genius eager for recognition, but as a skilled man worn down by circumstance, holding on to only the parts of his ability that still felt necessary to survive. Connor noticed Amelia's growing attention toward Mason and felt an uneasy pressure building beneath his own position. He feared that his authority inside the company was suddenly at risk. Connor placed a private call to Jackson, warning him that if clients learned the fault had come from a basic assembly mistake, the company would face heavy financial penalties. He proposed labeling the incident as a temporary sensor discrepancy instead of admitting the truth about the mechanical failure. Jackson agreed, primarily because he wanted to protect the company's public value and the confidence of its shareholders. Mason overheard a portion of this conversation by accident. He understood immediately that once the repair was finished, the true cause might quietly disappear from the official record, buried beneath language designed to protect reputation rather than reveal fact. Mason stood at a difficult crossroads. He could remain silent to protect the only stable income keeping his household afloat, or he could speak honestly and risk everything to protect the people who would eventually fly inside that aircraft during a real emergency. He thought of his daughter waiting for him at home, of the bills folded quietly inside his wallet, and of the spinner resting warm against his chest. Neither choice felt easy, and for the first time that night, the weight on his shoulders had nothing to do with propellers or washers at all. It had everything to do with what kind of man he still wanted to be once the sun rose and the hangar doors finally opened. The replacement components arrived at the plant just before dawn, leaving only a few hours before the scheduled handover. Amelia allowed Mason to help supervise the repair, though Connor deliberately assigned him minor tasks in an attempt to diminish his role in front of the rest of the team. Mason did not react to the slight. He calmly inspected the new locking washer, checked the surface cleanliness, verified the alignment marks, confirmed the torque settings, and tested for thermal slippage across a range of simulated temperatures. The engineering team slowly began to realize that Mason understood this system far more deeply than his maintenance title suggested. Several younger engineers quietly began following his instructions, even as Connor watched with visible frustration. Mason then noticed another warning sign buried inside the paperwork. This washer failure did not appear to be an isolated accident. There was a real possibility that an entire batch of supporting components had been marked with the wrong orientation somewhere back in storage. This revelation raised the stakes even further. If Mason was right, the problem was not limited to the A-17 alone. Every other aircraft built using parts from that same batch would need to be checked before anyone trusted them again. Jackson Owen grew furious, accusing Mason of turning a small mechanical fix into a full-blown public relations disaster. Mason replied evenly that the true disaster would be allowing a faulty aircraft to leave this hangar in the first place. Amelia faced an impossible decision. Expanding the inspection risk, delaying the handover even further, yet skipping it risked gambling with human lives somewhere out in a future storm. She remembered Mason's earlier warning, the one about what might happen if Connor turned out to be wrong instead of him. Amelia ordered an immediate inspection of the entire batch of related components, marking the first real moment where she chose safety over public image without hesitation. Connor grew angrier still, since the widening inspection exposed weaknesses inside his own engineering team for everyone to see. He tried once more to shift blame onto Mason, claiming that Mason's unofficial intervention had somehow corrupted the accuracy of the testing results. Evelyn countered him directly with hard evidence, showing that the uneven wear pattern existed well before Mason had ever touched the shaft assembly. During this expanded inspection, Mason used the fidget spinner again, this time as a quick reference tool for comparing the smoothness of 3 separate shaft assemblies that had been removed for testing. He was not performing for anyone. His method was simple and consistent, using the spinner to feel the difference between motion that moved freely and motion quietly dragged off its natural path. One of the younger engineers asked Mason who had ever taught him a method like this. Mason answered simply that sometimes the plainest questions from a child could remind a grown person of principles they had almost forgotten entirely. The remark landed softly, yet it struck something inside Amelia. She understood in that moment that Mason was not leaning on fatherhood to win sympathy from anyone in the room. He was simply surviving on the small, steady things that still kept him standing upright through everything life had taken from him. By the end of this expanded search, the team discovered 2 additional washers marked with the same reversed orientation. Mason had not merely solved one isolated failure. He had quietly prevented what could have become a chain of accidents spread across multiple aircraft, each one waiting to fail at the worst possible moment during an actual mission. The hours passed in a blur of torque wrenches, temperature gauges, and quiet tension, yet through all of it Mason remained steady, methodical, and unshaken by the growing hostility directed at him from Connor's side of the room. Evelyn found herself watching him with something close to admiration, recognizing in his patience the discipline of someone who had once carried far greater professional weight than anyone here understood. As sunrise crept closer through the hangar windows, the exhausted team finally sealed the last replacement component into place, uncertain whether their work would hold once tested at full operating speed in front of the people who mattered most. Mason wiped his hands on a rag, tucked the spinner back into his pocket, and allowed himself a single quiet breath before the real test began. As the truth of the failure came fully into view, Connor Ryan shifted from mockery into something closer to open defense of his own career. He understood that if the final report clearly stated his team had missed a basic assembly error, the damage to his reputation could follow him for years. Connor quietly altered the preliminary report, rewriting it to suggest the fault had been uncovered through his engineering team's standard data analysis process, reducing Mason's involvement to nothing more than basic physical assistance. Jackson Owen agreed with the change, since he wanted to present the situation to clients as something the leadership team had always kept firmly under control. Evelyn discovered the altered report, but lacked the authority alone to block it from moving forward. She brought the matter directly to Amelia, laying out 2 difficult paths in front of her. Amelia could sign a polished but dishonest report, or she could sign the honest version and risk drawing scrutiny that might trigger a deeper investigation into the company's practices. Amelia faced enormous pressure from every direction. The board called repeatedly throughout the morning. The client was scheduled to arrive within hours. Journalists had already begun gathering just outside the plant gates, sensing a larger story unfolding behind the walls. Mason knew about the altered report but never demanded personal credit for himself. He asked only that the record reflect the true mechanical cause, so that the other affected aircraft could be properly inspected before anyone else nearby was put at risk. Connor took advantage of Mason's restraint, announcing in front of the assembled staff that Mason was simply a lucky bystander who did not understand the legal consequences of the claims he was making. Mason remained calm, though this time he did not back down the way he had through most of the night. He asked for the testing floor's internal camera footage and the full maintenance log to be reviewed openly in front of everyone present. Connor smiled thinly, confident that no one in leadership would ever choose to stand beside a maintenance worker over an experienced lead engineer. Amelia stayed quiet, watching the confrontation unfold. This moment had become the true test of her character. She had once believed victory mattered above everything else, yet Mason had shown her that certain victories quietly turn into failures once they are built upon concealment rather than truth. Evelyn pulled up the internal recording. The footage clearly showed Mason as the first person to identify the exact location of the fault using the spinner, Connor as the one who resisted the idea at every turn, and Jackson as the one who had wanted Mason removed from the testing floor entirely. The room fell into an uncomfortable frozen silence. Connor tried to pivot the conversation, arguing that using a child's toy inside a serious engineering environment reflected poorly on professional standards. Mason explained himself once more, speaking slowly and without frustration. The fidget spinner had never been installed into the aircraft, had never replaced any actual component, and had never violated any established safety procedure. It functioned only as a simple tool for revealing mechanical resistance through the principle of free spinning rotation. Evelyn confirmed that his method had never compromised safety, since it made no contact whatsoever with the final operating system of the aircraft. Amelia made her decision. She removed Connor from leading the project until an independent review could take place. This marked the first real collapse for Connor, the man who had laughed the loudest hours earlier now standing powerless in a room he no longer controlled. Jackson tried to intervene on Connor's behalf, but Amelia held firm, unwilling to let politics override the plain mechanical truth sitting in front of everyone. Mason watched the exchange quietly, feeling no satisfaction in Connor's fall, only a steady relief that the truth had finally found its way into daylight. Amelia turned toward him, and for the first time that night she used his full name, asking him to join Evelyn in completing the final safety verification before the aircraft could be cleared for its ultimate test. Mason nodded once, quietly, and followed her toward the hangar floor, without a single word of protest or pride. After the components had been replaced and the entire related batch fully inspected, the A-17 rolled out onto the testing runway just as dawn broke over the horizon. The sky still hung gray, the concrete slick with reflected light, the air thick with a mixture of hope and tension that seemed to press down on everyone gathered there. The engineering team, the client representatives, members of the board, and a handful of journalists all stood waiting, each of them aware that a failed test now would likely end Grace Aero Rescue for good. Mason stood behind the row of engineers, uncertain about placing himself anywhere near the center of attention. He still wore his maintenance uniform, his hands still faintly marked with grease from the night before. Amelia noticed standing apart and asked him to move forward, standing beside Evelyn near the main control panel instead. The request drew visible surprise from several people nearby. Connor stood further back, his authority over the project suspended, his expression carrying something close to bitterness. He kept his arms folded tightly across his chest, watching the man he had mocked hours earlier now standing exactly where he himself had once expected to stand. The engine began its startup sequence. The propeller turned slowly at first, then gradually increased in speed. The initial sound was smooth and even. Mason closed his eyes briefly, listening carefully to every rotation. When the engine climbed past the exact threshold that had triggered failure the night before, the entire group seemed to hold its breath together. The safety sensor did not lock. The monitoring display remained steady and stable. Yet the test was not finished. As the system shifted into a simulated high wind load, a slight oscillation appeared briefly on the readout. Connor immediately declared that Mason had failed to solve the underlying problem after all. Mason stayed calm, studying the readings closely, and quickly recognized that this reaction had nothing to do with the earlier washer failure. This was simply a normal adjustment response as the propeller adapted naturally to simulated wind resistance. He asked for the rotation speed to be held steady for 10 additional seconds instead of shutting the test down immediately. Amelia turned to Evelyn, asking whether this was within safe limits. Evelyn confirmed that it remained well inside the acceptable range. Those 10 seconds stretched out like an entire minute for everyone watching. The oscillation gradually settled. The propeller found its balance naturally and every indicator on the control panel shifted into a fully cleared status. The A-17 began rolling forward, lifted its nose gently, and rose smoothly off the runway into the pale morning sky. Amelia watched the aircraft climb, her eyes glassy with relief, knowing the company had just been saved, though what mattered even more to her in that instant was the simple fact that this particular aircraft was now genuinely verifiably safe. Mason did not celebrate. He simply exhaled slowly and let his fingers rest briefly against the fidget spinner still resting quietly in his pocket. One young engineer began to clap. Then another joined him, and soon the applause spread across the entire runway in a wave of relief and disbelief. Connor did not clap. Jackson stood silent as well, their stillness quietly foreshadowing a different kind of conflict still waiting to unfold, one concerning how this entire story would eventually be told to the outside world. The aircraft circled back gracefully, completing its full test sequence without a single flaw. Amelia understood in that moment that she owed Mason far more than simple gratitude. She owed him a public acknowledgement of the truth, spoken clearly, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. That debt would not wait quietly in the background for long, and Amelia already knew there was no version of the coming hours where she could avoid paying it. Following the successful test flight, the board asked Amelia to deliver a short statement to the media gathered outside the plant. Jackson handed her a prepared press release before she could even collect her thoughts. Inside that release, Mason was never mentioned by name at all. The failure had been softened into a vague phrase describing a routine late-stage technical adjustment. Jackson argued that this framing protected the company's value, insisting that clients had no need to know that an ordinary maintenance employee had solved the problem using his daughter's fidget spinner. Amelia held the folded release in her hand and glanced across the hangar floor, where Mason quietly gathered his tools into a worn bag near the far wall. She thought back to herself, only hours earlier, someone willing to trust a title over the truth, someone almost willing to ignore the quietest voice in the room entirely. Evelyn spoke to her privately, reminding her that a genuine culture of safety could never be built upon carefully polished reports designed to hide uncomfortable facts. Amelia walked out to face the board, the client representatives, and the small crowd of journalists waiting near the entrance. The atmosphere grew tense as everyone expected her to read directly from the prepared statement in her hand. Instead, she folded the paper closed and set it aside. She spoke plainly, informing everyone present that Grace Aero Rescue had discovered a serious assembly error inside the propeller pitch adjustment system, and that the discovery had come directly from Mason Carter, a maintenance employee with an unusually strong background in mechanical engineering. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Jackson's face went pale. Connor lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Amelia clarified carefully that Mason had never used a toy to replace any actual aircraft part. He had instead applied the basic principle of free spinning rotation from an old fidget spinner to detect a resistance that the entire engineering team had somehow overlooked. This distinction mattered greatly, keeping the story both dramatic and believable at once. Listeners understood that the value never rested inside the object itself, but inside the eye of a man who still recognized fundamental principles hiding inside the simplest tools. A representative from the federal client asked whether the other aircraft in the fleet were now confirmed safe. Mason answered honestly, admitting that certainty could not exist until the entire related batch of components had been fully inspected. That honest answer visibly startled Jackson, yet it earned something far more valuable from the client, genuine trust rooted in transparency rather than polish. Amelia immediately committed to a full inspection across the fleet, along with self-reported disclosure and independent oversight moving forward. This was the true turning point in Amelia's own character arc, choosing short-term embarrassment over long-term integrity. The board initially resisted the plan, but the client valued the honesty enough to keep the contract alive, agreeing instead to delay final delivery until every safety check had been properly completed. Mason was invited to join the emergency review team overseeing the wider inspection. He did not accept immediately, wary of becoming some kind of media symbol rather than simply continuing his quiet work. Amelia told him gently that she was not looking for a symbol at all. She needed someone willing to speak the truth in a room where everyone else had already chosen convenient silence, and that quality mattered to her far more than any title he might eventually agree to wear. Mason looked at her for a long moment, weighing the offer against everything he had built to protect the quiet stability of his life, before finally allowing himself a slow, careful nod. In the weeks following the crisis, Connor Ryan came under internal investigation for altering the safety report and pressuring others to conceal the true cause of the failure. Jackson Owen was removed from any authority over safety-related decisions by order of the board. Amelia restructured parts of the company, placing Evelyn Madison in charge of building a stronger safety culture and inviting Mason to lead a small team dedicated to identifying real-world mechanical failures before they ever reached a runway. Mason initially declined the larger title offered to him, unwilling to let his daily life become unrecognizable. He still wanted uninterrupted time with his daughter, still wanted his evenings to belong to their small, steady routine together. Amelia did not push him towards something he did not want. Instead, she proposed a role built specifically around his needs, a flexible technical advisor position with better pay, and the standing authority to halt any test the moment he identified a genuine safety concern. This reward fit Mason's character precisely. He never wanted applause or headlines. He wanted stability, respect, and the authority to protect what was right without needing anyone's permission first. After everything that had happened, that quiet authority meant more to him than any amount of public recognition ever could. Mason accepted the offer under one condition. He asked that no employee working in a lower position ever be dismissed again for speaking up about a safety concern. Amelia agreed immediately and made the request into official company policy. The old fidget spinner eventually found a home inside a small glass case in the training room, displayed not as some magical object but as a simple symbol of a deeper principle. The idea that the largest failures often hide behind the smallest details, missed only because pride kept people from truly looking closely. Mason's daughter still remained outside the direct frame of the story, exactly as before. Only one small emotional detail closed her thread quietly. Mason sent her a short message explaining that her old toy had helped keep many people safe that day. Her reply never needed to be shown on the page. It only needed Mason's small, quiet smile in response. Amelia noticed that smile and understood something important in that instant. Mason had never fixed that aircraft to prove his own worth to anyone. He had fixed it because he understood that every single flight carried someone waiting somewhere for a safe return. A brief, gentle moment passed between Mason and Amelia afterward, carrying the soft suggestion of something warmer beginning to grow between them. She thanked him sincerely, and he replied that she was the one who had truly saved the company, simply by choosing honesty in the one moment when silence would have been far easier. Neither of them rushed toward anything more than that. There was only a quiet, growing respect settling gently between two people who had each been tested in very different ways during the same long night. By the time the plant returned to its normal rhythm, something inside its culture had changed permanently. The man once treated as invisible had become someone the entire team now paused to listen to, not because of any title attached to his name, but because everyone finally understood exactly how much he had always known. Somewhere beneath the ordinary uniform and the quiet daily routine, a steady kind of expertise had been waiting patiently to be noticed, and now at last it finally was. Several weeks later, the A-17 was officially assigned to its first genuine rescue mission, flying directly into a region facing a major storm. Grace Aero Rescue monitored the flight from its operations room, the atmosphere tense but never fearful, since every inspection this time had been carried out correctly and completely. The aircraft pushed through strong winds, its propeller system holding steady, and reached the isolated area to deliver essential relief equipment exactly as planned. The story kept its focus on the pilot, the rescue crew, and the mission signal rather than describing anyone waiting on the ground, keeping the emotional weight centered on duty and competence rather than added vulnerability. When the confirmation of a safe landing finally came through, the entire operations room broke into quiet relief. Amelia looked toward Mason. Neither of them needed to say very much in that moment. Connor no longer worked at the company. Jackson no longer held any authority over safety decisions of any kind. Evelyn had already placed a simple phrase inside the training room, reminding every new employee that data mattered greatly, but that a person willing to truly listen to that data mattered even more. Mason stood near the observation window, watching the aircraft's signal steady on the monitoring screen. He took the fidget spinner from his pocket, spun it once quietly, and slipped it back where it belonged. Amelia walked over and told him that the company wanted to name its new safety training program after the very principle he had proven that night. Mason offered a simple, modest name in return, calling it the Small Things Check. The story closed with Mason walking out of the plant as morning lights spread across the lot, no longer an invisible man lost among 30 confident engineers. He remained at heart an ordinary single father carrying on with an ordinary life, yet somewhere above him an entire sky now understood exactly what those steady, unassuming hands had once made possible. The lesson lingered quietly behind him. A person too easily dismissed is not always without value. Sometimes that person is simply standing in the corner of the room, seeing clearly what the proudest people in the building had already chosen to overlook. This story carried a simple truth, worth holding on to long after the final scene fades. The most valuable people in any room are not always the ones speaking loudest or standing closest to the center of attention. Sometimes they are quietly working at the edges, overlooked, underestimated, and easy to dismiss, yet carrying exactly the steady skill and patience needed when everything else begins to fail. Mason Carter never asked to be seen as extraordinary. He simply refused to stay silent when silence could cost someone their life, choosing honesty over comfort, even when comfort would have been so much easier to accept. If this story moved something in you, carry that lesson forward into your own life. Look closer at the quiet people around you, because sometimes they are the ones truly holding everything steady.